Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar all about the European Inland Waterways. I'm Paul Knox-Johnston, the Sales and Marketing Manager for Havre Knox-Johnston, and I'm delighted to be your host for this evening. We have been putting on webinars for the boating community since 2021 or 2021, whichever you prefer, which normally involves convincing all manner of experts to come and share, share their expert knowledge for free. We have had lithium battery experts, paint experts, marine surveyors, sailing technical experts, all sorts, and on a wide variety of subjects. Last year, we realised that our friends at the Cruising Association had a wealth of knowledge in-house, and we put on a very successful webinar about crossing the Channel and cruising North France with Bob Garrett. This year, they have come up trumps again, lending us not just one expert, but four. In January, we were joined by John Burbeck, who shared with us an extremely insightful presentation on orca interactions. You can watch the recording of that on our YouTube channel, Haven KJ. Tonight, they have lent us three experts to share their knowledge all about the European Inland Waterways. And with nearly 30,000 kilometres of navigable rivers and canals in Europe, it's no wonder we need three experts. I have to admit, before getting involved with this presentation, sailing the European inland waterways wasn't something that instantly came to mind. However, my eyes have certainly been opened to a whole new cruising area, which I can't wait to find out more about. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our European waterways experts. Firstly, welcome Gordon Knight. Gordon has spent 40 years cruising under sail, mostly in Northern European and Mediterranean waters. During that time, as an admin on the World Cruising Wiki, he created several Mediterranean sections, providing vital information to a huge proportion of the boating community. A long-standing member of the Cruising Association, when he's not busy in his role as editor of numerous Cruising Association cruising guides, you try saying that, to the European Inland Waterways, you can find him cruising the inland waterways of the Netherlands with his wife. Next up, we have Andy Mulholland. Welcome, Andy. Since retiring, Andy, together with his wife Gwen, have been very busy cruising more than 20,000 kilometers of the European inland waterways. A particular expert when it comes to cruising the Dutch waterways, Andy has co-authored several Cruising Association cruising guides, including 50 great inland cruising routes in the Netherlands and the Cruising Association Guide to the Netherlands Standing Mast Routes. Last but not least, we have Julian Dusek. Some of you may recognise Jules as a former Cruising Association president. A glutton for punishment, he is now the secretary for the European Inland Waterways Section. Jules is the French expert on the panel, having embarked with his wife Vanessa on an incredible journey through the French inland waterways to the Mediterranean in their southerly. They then spent the next 6 years exploring from Greece to Venice before returning via the inland waterways to Calais. They're now based in Holland, where they cruise from. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Gordon. And Gordon, would you like to share your presentation and tell us all about the European Inland Waterways?
Good evening, everyone. I hope in this presentation to answer most of the questions that you may have about the inland waterways, and possibly even one or two that you don't currently have. Firstly, I'm going to be looking at answering four key questions. What are the attractions of the inland waterways? Then looking at why people cruise them in the first place. Answering the question, what kind of boat do you need to cruise the waterways? And then finally, where to go for information. And then in the second part, I'm going to look at some of the more practical considerations, e.g., what sort of qualifications do you need? Are there rules and regulations that you need to comply with? How do you prepare your boat? Because it is very different from sea sailing. What's it actually like cruising the European inland waterways in terms of handling locks, bridges, and tunnels? And then finally, most importantly, what does it all cost? And the good news is that from my experience, you can reckon about a third or even a quarter of the cost of keeping a similar boat in UK waters. So what are the attractions? Well, firstly, it's a beautiful way to see Europe. Most of the great cities and towns and villages of Europe grew up around the waterways. And most of the waterways go straight into the historic centres. So it's a beautiful way to arrive at a place. Secondly, it's much less stressful than sea sailing. And those of you who are sea sailors who spent nights at anchor in a rising wind, or who've been parked next to Russian charterers knocking back the vodka till 3 o'clock in the morning will know exactly what I mean. You need limited experience. In fact, most of the hire companies, as long as you can turn a steering wheel and work a throttle, will let you rent a boat on the Inland Waterways for trial sail. And there's, by comparison with sea sailing, much less bureaucracy and regulation. The costs are a fraction. If I tell you that to keep our boat in the UK in a South Coast marina would currently cost around £15,000 a year, to keep our boat as we do on the inland waterways, we actually spend around about £2,500 a year. So the infrastructure cost is considerably lower than in the UK. So why do people do it in the first place? One of the key reasons is people use it to transit down to the Mediterranean, and several hundred yachts make this trip every year to avoid going around the outside and across the Bay of Biscay. Others use it to go north through the Netherlands to transit the Baltic. Most of us in the Inland Waterways section use it for the purposes of leisure tourism. And finally, although this is more difficult since we are now a third country following Brexit, a number of people move aboard permanently and in some cases even run a business from the inland waterways. So let's look briefly first at transit to the Mediterranean. There are basically 4 entry points to reach the Med, 3 of them in the English Channel, 1 of them in the Bay of Biscay. The 3 routes in the Channel are from Calais, St Valery at the mouth of the Somme, and from Le Havre. They all eventually converge on the Seine just below Paris. And then you go through Paris, and then there are 3 alternative routes to go down to the River Saône in Burgundy. The River Saône joins the Rhone at Lyon and through there to the Med at Port St Louis. The basic parameters of the main routes from the channel are that they can be achieved with a maximum draft of 1.8 meters and a maximum air draft of 3.45. In terms of time, a rapid transit would take around 4 to 5 weeks, a more leisurely transit around about 6 to 7. And in fact, some of our members spend most of the summer going down to the Mediterranean. Looking at the route from Calais first, this route's a little bit deeper than some of the others at 2.2 meters. And indeed, it is quite a useful cruise to get a sample of the inland waterways to cruise down to Paris. And there's 1 tunnel on the route to be negotiated. The second route goes up the River Somme into the Canal du Nord. This is not a route to be tackled with a draft of much more than 1.5 meters. The Somme estuary is quite shallow and has shifting sandbanks. So if your boat has a draft of more than 1.5 meters, it's not the route for you. The route that most sailing boats use to travel to the Med is up the River Seine to Paris. This has the benefit of a greater draft of 3.5 meters, though with all these routes, once you go beyond Paris, you're limited to 1.8 meters. Below Paris, there are 3 routes. One is a very attractive route, goes through the Champagne district and down the canal through Champagne de Bourgogne into the River Saône. This route has 3 tunnels to be negotiated, which is quite challenging if you haven't done a tunnel before. And the maximum draft of 1.8 meters is more consistent. The other routes in particularly dry summers can have less water, and so if your draft is close to this limit, then this is the route to take. The second route, another very attractive route, goes down through the Loire Valley and then across via the Canal de Centre into the Saône. Although this route has no tunnels and a maximum draft of 1.8 meters, it is not a very good route to take if you're going in high summer. The reason being it is more subject to drought than some of the other routes, and you may find that some of the lock pans have a reduced draft of 1.6 or even 1.5 meters. And then the third route is via the River Yonne and the Canal de Bourgogne. This is really a route only for small vessels. Maximum draft in the pounds is about 1.4 meters. And there's one tunnel 2/3 of the way down, which has a draft of only 3 meters. All of these three routes wind up in the River Seine and down the Seine to Lyon, where it joins with the River Rhone. There is one further route, which goes via the Canal de Midi, entering at Royan and going through the Mediterranean at Sète. This again is a route to be undertaken only by a fairly small shallow draft yacht. You're looking at a maximum draft of 1.4 meters and a maximum air draft of 3.3. It's a route that can be accomplished within about 12 to 14 days. A more leisurely transit would take 3 to 4 weeks. But some people spend most of the summer because the Canal de Midi is very attractive. The second reason to cruise is to transit north to the Baltic. Most of you, if you are sea sailors, will be familiar with the standing mast routes in the Netherlands. These are routes that go through canals with lifting bridges, and they enable yachts with a mast height of up to 35 meters or more to navigate them, and with a draft of 1.9 to 2.5 meters. There are three main entry points: Vlissingen in the south, IJmuiden at the mouth of the Noordzee Canal through to Amsterdam, and and Deenhelde at the northern tip of Noord-Holland. All three routes eventually wound up in Delfzijl, which is on the border with Germany, and from there it's about a 24-hour sail up to the Kiel Canal and then through to the Baltic. It does avoid the challenges of sailing the North Sea at certain times of the year. By entering at Vlissingen, there's a distance of 550 kilometers to be negotiated, and that's a route that can be accomplished within about 10 to 14 days. The second route at IJmuiden shortens the distance to about 308 kilometers, and this can be accomplished if you travel every day within about 6 to 7 days. And finally, the shortest route involves making landfall at Deenhelde, sailing across the Waddenzee to the Dutch harbour of Haarlem, and this can reduce the transit time to Delfzijl to around about 4 to 5 days. It's important to point out that the depth on this route is slightly lower than the rest. So from Harlingen to rejoin the main route, the draft is only 1.9 meters. I should also mention two routes that are taken quite frequently by Dutch boats as a way to go through to the Polish harbour of, forgive my pronunciation if it's wrong, Świnoujście, I think it's called. This is a route that can be undertaken by any boat with an air draft of 3.5 meters and a maximum draft of 2 meters. It's just over 1,000 kilometers, and it can be accomplished if you sail every day in about 3 to 4 weeks. And there is a further shorter route which turns north and arrives at the Baltic at the German harbour of Travemünde, just north of Lübeck. This has the same parameters, 3.5 meters air draft and 2 meters draft, but it does shorten the distance to about 862 kilometers and takes about 2 to 3 weeks. But most of our members spend their time cruising the inland waterways for purposes of leisure tourism. And I'm just going to show you a few examples of some of the attractions to be encountered. Firstly, what better way can there be to enter the heart of Paris than on the inland waterways? This is the sight that greets you as you travel up the Seine. Or in the Netherlands, you can travel right through the heart of some of the greatest and most historic cities, such as Leiden, which has one of the oldest universities in the country and where Albert Einstein was a professor. Or in Ghent, in Belgium, for example, you can moor your boat literally 200 or 300 yards from the medieval quarter of Graaslui, And the cost overnight is not much more than parking your car in the centre for a day. There are numerous historic attractions. Um, this is the Canal de Saint in Belgium, where there are four historic hydraulic lifts. It's an amazing experience to go through them. They're operated entirely for leisure craft now. There are no commercial craft. They take about a morning to go through, and they're run by enthusiastic volunteers. And it's one of the most amazing experiences you can encounter on the inland waterways. France, of course, has more historic towns and villages than you can shake a stick at. This is one in the town of Saint-Ming on the Canal de la Sarre. It's one that one of the Impressionists should really have painted, although Monet seems to be more concerned with canals in Venice and Amsterdam than in his own backyard. One of my personal favourites is the town of Schiedam, just west of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. This was an important centre of gin production in the 19th century, and the town is ringed by tall windmills of the kind you can see in the background, which were used to mill the grain for gin production. And just through the bridge on the right-hand side, you'll see a small wooden staging. That is outside the one surviving distillery, which is now a museum. So you can park there completely free of charge, while the wafts of the botanicals from the gin distillation waft across your boat. There are numerous beautiful villages and towns to be found on the inland waterways. This is Marais-sur-Loing in France. This one was actually painted by an Impressionist, but not a French one. The English Impressionist painter Alfred Sisley lived there for many years, painted this scene, and the moorings are literally about 5 minutes walk away from where this photo is taken. In the Netherlands, for example, you can motor right into the historic 17th century harbour of Housden, moor totally free for as many nights as you want. And within 5 minutes, you can be sipping a cold Heineken in one of the bars or cafes up in the town. In Germany, for example, the town of Saarburg, the moorings are just below the bridge. You can be up in the town visiting the 12th century castle within minutes, and then spend the afternoon sampling some of the delicious dry white wines that they grow in the area. But for many people, one of the joys of the inland waterways is the sheer peace and tranquility. This is an example in Friesland. There's an organization called the Marrakeet Foundation who have installed over 600 of these free moorings, many of them in the national parks. Here you can enjoy complete peace and quiet, and you go to sleep to the hooting of owls and you wake to the sounds of birdsong. Off many of the rivers, there are gravel pits formerly used for extracting gravel. When they've finished the extraction, they flood them and landscape them, and you can go into these, you can anchor for free, or in many of them, there are free moorings that you can tie up to. This particular one is the lovely medieval town of Liverdun on the upper reaches of the Moselle in France. And finally, one of the real attractions of France is that, assuming the banks are suitable, you can tie up almost anywhere on the inland waterways. Many boats carry mooring pegs. You can drive in a mooring peg and stay there in peace and quiet for as long as you want. In France, most of the towpaths have been surfaced. They're very popular with cyclists. So if you have cycles aboard, you can cycle into town, pick up your morning baguette and top up your wine and stay there, assuming your water and your batteries hold out for several weeks. And so finally, the liveaboard lifestyle. This is something that has become more difficult for most of us Brits following Brexit. Now we are limited to a maximum of 90 days on the inland waterways. We can't stay 6 or 7 months as we used to be able to at the time. It is still possible to get a 6-month visa in France. I'll come on to explain that later. But for all other European countries, the only way to stay aboard for long periods is to take out residency. And I'm afraid that this kind of lifestyle for us Brits is something to be remembered with fondness. Incidentally, at one point, this was taken in France, this photo, and in France, the French don't use their canals very much. They're much more popular for fishing. You generally find about 20 fishermen for every French motorboat. I wouldn't actually, if you do emulate the fishermen, I wouldn't actually put a fish on this barbecue. I would throw it back again, and you'll learn later why. It's because of what they pump out into the French canals. So coming on to the reality of what kind of boat you need for the inland waterways. Well, of course, if you're French, you take to the waterways in almost anything. This appears to be a punt with a garden shed on top. I don't think you would ever make it to England in that. But it does make a serious point that within certain parameters, you can go on the inland waterways with almost anything. These are the notional parameters. The maximum length of 38 meters is really the statutory limit on the waterways in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In Germany, it's limited to 20 meters, really, because above that limit, you need special qualifications, which is very difficult for non-Germans to get. However, in reality, I would recommend a length of between 12 and 15 meters. Once you go above 12 meters, you begin to find that some of the smaller little harbors in France and in Germany off the Rhine, you can't get into if you're over 12. Once you go over 15 meters, and certainly if you intend to go on the smaller waterways in France, you may have difficulty turning round. You can imagine in this channel that you see in the photo, if you did have to go back, you'd have to reverse quite a long way before you could turn around. With a draft of 1.8 meters or below, you can go almost anywhere on the inland waterways. I would say probably about 95, 98% of the waterways. And a maximum air draft of 3.5 meters will also take you anywhere. The Netherlands is slightly different insofar as being a very flat country, most of the bridges are lifting, and therefore on the main waterways, you can get by with an air draft of 4 meters or even higher. But on the smaller waterways, which have fixed bridges, you need to be able to reduce your draft around about 2.8 meters or below to accomplish it. Now to go to a few examples of boats that our members use. This is a classic Dutch steel motorboat, and I would say these kind of boats represent anything up to half the boats on the inland waterways or more. This particular member crosses the North Sea every year into the inland waterways. What makes it a seagoing boat is the level of equipment. He has radar, a chart platter, a life raft and flares. Without those additional pieces of equipment, this is a pretty standard inland waterways boat, and it weighs in about 13 meters. However, this member has mobility problems and therefore didn't want different levels in his boat. He also uses a boat in the Netherlands where the ability to reduce the draft about 2.5 meters means he can travel down some of these smaller waterways. Another member went down to the Med in a bilge keel sailing yacht, having taken his mast out on entry to the waterways. In fact, they enjoyed it so much, they turned around, came back, sold the boat, and they now have a Dutch steel boat for the inland waterways. Another member, who is actually present today, enjoys the best of both worlds. For many years, he sailed across the channel in his southerly with a lifting keel, took the mast out in Calais, traveled around the inland waterways for several weeks, put the mast back in Calais and returned home. These days, he enjoys the inland waterways much more than the sea, and he and his wife travel around without the mast, which is gathering dust, I believe, in Calais. This member was Med-bound, and spent 6 weeks going down through the canals. You can see the level of equipment that they installed for the purpose. Plenty of fenders, a fender board amidships, and even a jury mast, so they could mount a VHF aerial and fly a courtesy ensign. This boat actually has a draft of about 1.4 meters. It has a lifting keel, and having spent their 6 to 7 weeks getting down there, they're now, I believe, bound for Greece. And finally, this is a members liveaboard Dutch barge. The name Dutch doesn't necessarily mean that it's built in the Netherlands. It's simply a type and a size of boat that was much used for commercial delivery in the Netherlands in the last century. The point about this size of boat, it does allow you, if you intend to live aboard, to install many of the luxuries of modern life, such as dishwasher, washing machine, even perhaps a jacuzzi if you really wish for it. The downside is, of course, the places you can moor a boat like this are considerably more limited. And of course, if you do decide to move, the cost of fuel is quite substantial. However, for most liveaboards, that is not the point. They're quite happy to spend several months or even years in the same point. But the main advantage, if they do decide to relocate, then they can simply take up their mooring, move somewhere else where they accept long-term residential barges and move around. It's rather like having a movable country cottage. This particular member actually runs a small business from the boat, so as long as you have a decent internet connection, that's again a possibility. So how can you discover more about the European Inland Waterways? Well, perhaps here I can indulge myself with a little bit of an advertisement for the Inland Waterways section of the CA. We publish a suite of 25 guides to the inland waterways, which I believe is more than any other publisher in the English language. Their particular value is that they are updated annually by members, and we do have an app that enables members to post updates to the for inclusion in the guides. They're available in both digital and print versions, and the digital versions are free to members. The print versions are produced by Print on Demand, and the particular value of that is that not only can they be updated annually, but if there's a really important update, we can have new versions available to download and available to order in printed form within about 24 hours. For people completely new to the inland waterways, this is the book we offer, An Introduction to the European Inland Waterways. It reflects the collective experience of several generations of CA members, answers all the questions that you probably have to ask about the inland waterways. And indeed, this presentation is largely based on the content. And that one runs out at 110 pages of A4. The second publication, if you're using the inland waterways to head down to the Med through France, is this one. And this will give you all the details you need of how to prepare your boat. It contains maps of all the sections of the routes, details of moorings and facilities, and that weighs in at 150 pages of A4. If, on the other hand, you're heading the other way, up to the Baltic, we produce this publication. This includes details of all the cruises that you can do in the Netherlands, and quite a number of people who buy it use it just for that purpose. They don't go as far as the Baltic. Again, it contains maps of all the routes along the way and details of moorings and facilities. And that is 92 pages of A4. If you wish to spend more time in France and Belgium and explore some of the smaller waterways rather than head straight down to the Med, this is one of our oldest and most comprehensive publications. It covers all the preparations that you need to go through to cruise in France and Belgium. Again, it has maps of all the waterways, details of the moorings and the facilities, and it weighs in at a total of 270 pages of A4. We have a similar one of which Andy is the joint author, 50 Great Inland Cruising Routes in the Netherlands, which is primarily intended for cruise planning in the 12 different provinces. It details the best cruises in each region, along with distances, moorings, facilities, and that one weighs in at 300 pages of A4. We also produced three further guides, one to the German Rhine, another to the river Moselle, and a third to the Dutch islands of the Waddenzee. We produce also 17 mooring guides to the most popular French canals for cruising. And if you search the internet, European Inland Waterways Section, it will take you to our webpage, and you can download 10 free guidance notes on all the major aspects of cruising on the inland waterways. So coming on now to some of the more practical aspects. One of the questions that were most commonly asked, excuse me, is about the qualifications and experience that you need for the inland waterways. You don't need very much. You do require the International Certificate of Competence. And in fact, in Germany, you can't even hire a boat without actually having this. If you're a sailor, you may have this already. If you're a novice, you can get it with a fairly straightforward 2-day course at a Royal Yachting Association training centre. And assuming you pass, and it's not difficult, they will issue with the certificate. However, you do also require what is called the 7E endorsement. 7E is the European body that lays down standards for navigation on the inland waterways and for things like signage and communication. It's a fairly simple examination to take. You can download a free guide from the EIWS website, which explains all the parameters of the rules and illustrates all the signage. Once you've mugged up on that, you register for a simple online examination. You're given about 20 minutes. The questions are multi-choice questions, choice of 3. So it's even if you have to guess them, it's fairly straightforward. And at the end of that, if you pass, you're sent a certificate, which you send to the RIA or the other issuing authority for your certificate. And then they will then issue with the revised certificate that has the 7E endorsement. And then the only other thing you need is the VH operator's certificate. VHF is only compulsory in one country, which is Belgium. However, it's very strongly advised because without that, you're unable to communicate with other vessels on the waterways. And you look rather silly if you're sitting waiting outside a lock for an hour and a half when one simple VHF call to the lockkeeper will tell you what the problem is. What about rules and regulations? That is the second question we're most commonly asked. The only countries where you require any sort of license are France and in Belgium. In France, you require a vignette, which is sold by the VNF, the French Waterways Authority. You can get this for anything from a year to 1 day. You apply for it online, and you can then print out a little vignette which you stick in your boat cabin window. The costs are for a year for 12-meter boat, around about €400. And that cost goes to funding the service provided and all the lock keepers, because many of the French locks are still manually operated. In Belgium, there are two different schemes. In Flanders, there was a similar permit required to the French vignette. Again, this is applied for online, and again, you can pay for it for anything from 1 day to a year. And for a year, it's about half the price of the French vignette, about €200. If you cross the border into the French-speaking part, Wallonia, they have a different system called a permis de circulation. And what that involves is supplying your details at the first lock you arrive at in Belgium and explaining where you plan to go, your itinerary. they issue with a number which then stays with the boat. So anytime you visit Belgium in future, all you need to do is to quote that number, and they can access your details on the computer. There is no charge at all for that permit, and it's a fairly simple process to undertake. The second thing you will require, if you're subject to inspection by the authorities, you will need your boat ownership documents. And for British owners, the SSR, Small Ships Registers, is perfectly adequate. You may, now that the EU is a third, sorry, now that Britain is a third country, you may be asked for proof of VAT status. And I'm afraid that flying the red duster, the red ensign, is now a bit of a magnet for that particular issue, simply because you're not allowed to take your boat into the EU for longer than 18 months without being subject to EU VAT. This is a situation that's only likely to happen if you're entering the country. In our members' experience, when you're cruising actually around the waterway, you're very, very unlikely to be asked to produce evidence of VAT. The only time I've ever been asked myself was in Harlingen, which is a Dutch port of entry, when I was boarded by immigration and customs. As soon as I said that our boat had always been on the inland waterways and that we actually had arrived by the inland waterways rather than sea, they were quite happy to go away again. You will require your insurance certificate and be asked to produce it. A Havre Knox-Johnston certificate is very acceptable, although I have to say that other ones are also available. In Belgium and the Netherlands, you are required to carry a copy of the local regulations. They are in French and Dutch respectively, so they won't mean very much. But you can download them, and all that's required is to show that you've downloaded them into your tablet or your laptop, and that satisfies the requirement. You may also be asked to produce your VHF licenses, and this is both the license for the installation on the boat, which in the UK is issued by Ofcom, and of course your VHF operator's license. And then finally, the river police, if they board you for an inspection, are particularly hot on safety. They will inspect your fire extinguishers, and they will ensure that you have life jackets aboard for every member of your crew. They will even inspect the CO2 inflation cylinders to make sure they're in date. And indeed, it's an increasing trend that you are obliged to have your fire extinguishers inspected every year and certified. In the Netherlands, I believe it's you satisfy the requirement every 3 years, and in France and Belgium every year. I said at the outset that bureaucracy is much less on the inland waterways, and it is probably relatively unlikely that this will happen. The only time I've been stopped in 10 years was on the occasion in Harlingen, and that was because I was flying a red ensign in a port of entry. I've never been asked for any of this on the canals and waterways inland. So, what entry requirements need to be observed when you go onto the waterways? Well, of course, we are now a third country, and we join the other third countries insofar as we're limited to 90 days in 180. The way this works is when you arrive in the Schengen zone, any Schengen country, they count how many days that you spent prior to that day. If you spent less than 90, you can spend those days. If you spent more than 90, you'll not be allowed in. Effectively, it means that most people either cruise for 3 months and then lay up their boats, or certainly most of our members tend to split it into two. They do maybe 50 and 40 or 45 and 45, and then come back for the busy months of July and August when in some areas, the more popular areas, things can get very busy, and of course the temperatures are quite hot. In October this year, it is intended to introduce the European Entry and Exit System (EES), This will consist of supplying biometric data, in other words, a facial photograph and a fingerprint. When you first enter the Schengen zone, this will be done at the ports of disembarkation or at airports. The purpose of it is eventually to streamline entry and exit to the Schengen zone. So all you will have to do when it's fully operational is hold your passport against a screen and either wink at the camera so they can see your face or possibly use a fingerprint. It will streamline things eventually, but obviously in the early stages, when people are having to submit this information, it's likely to cause considerable congestion, which is why they're planning to launch it in October, November this year. The real crush is likely to come with the Easter holidays and certainly in the early summer. So this is something that we'll have to be allowed for. When you've actually submitted the information, gone through the process, you only need to do it again after 3 years, and there's no charge for the system at all. There is another system that's being introduced 6 months after EES, in reality, probably towards the end of next year. And this is the European Travel Information and Authorization System. This is designed to issue permits for travel into the Schengen zone in advance of the actual date of travel. What you will need to do is to enter your passport and personal information online into the ETIAS database, and then you receive an authorization to travel. You can travel as many times in and out of the zone as you require, 3 years until again you need to renew the process. There is a small charge of €7 for this particular permit, although it is waived for the over 70s and the under 18s. Eventually, as I say, they will considerably streamline the whole process and make it more seamless, but there will be inevitable disruption in the early stages. There is, as I mentioned earlier, only one option for long-term cruising, which is in France, where you can apply for a visa called the VLST-T. This can be issued for up to 6 months, and it is the only visa you can obtain which will allow you to cruise around the waterways. Usually the requirement is to show that you keep your boat on a mooring in France, either in marina or at a yard, or else that you intend to spend most of the term of the visa cruising within the country. So how do you prepare your boat for the inland waterways? Firstly, you need to consider the engine. If you're going to cruise the canals, then a horsepower of about 50 horsepower is perfectly adequate. However, if you intend to embark on the big rivers where currents can be quite strong, it's better to have 120 to 150 horsepower. The propulsion, twin screw boats do go on the inland waterways, though they are not ideal. If you look at this photo, which is of our boat moored on the Canal de Bourgogne, you'll see that when you moor to the bank, you are quite close to the bank. The depths at the banks of most of the canals are usually shallower than in the centre, and you can see why there is a risk if you have twin props of your bankside prop fouling when you moor up at the bank or when you leave. So the ideal boat for the inland waterways is a single screw boat, not twin screw. It makes sense if you're taking a boat to the inland waterways to have any major servicing that's required or engine overhaul done before you go. Getting servicing done can be a little bit patchy depending on where you are, and it's quite a good idea to be reasonably self-sufficient, at least in terms of being able to do basic maintenance. For the same reason, it's useful to carry a range of spares, and as an absolute bare minimum, I would suggest spare fuel filters, spare oil filters, perhaps a refill of oil, and a spare engine impeller. Many boats carry quite a comprehensive range, It can make all the difference between being able to get underway again if you have a failure somewhere, and having to sit around for maybe 10 days to a fortnight while you source and get something replaced that's gone AWOL. Instrumentation, you don't really need much more than depth, speed, and I mentioned before VHF. Uh, some boats have chart plotters, and you can get, of course, charts that cover the inland waterways, but they're not very detailed. Most people tend to use a tablet or plotter with an app that's dedicated to the inland waterways, which can be downloaded and has the benefit of being updated almost on a continuous basis. Coming to safety equipment, you cannot have too many fenders on the inland waterways. When you're going through locks, they can occasionally be turbulent, and damage can be sustained if you don't have plenty of fenders. It's advisable to have two boat hooks. This is not particularly for picking up moorings, it's for dropping your mooring lines over bollards when you're entering locks, and of course sometimes when you're tying up to moorings on the banks. You must have life jackets for every person aboard, and as I mentioned before, it's important to check that they're in date. And indeed, on the big rivers, you may well find on occasion that the lock keepers will refuse to allow you into the lock unless you're wearing a life jacket. You need a horn. A lot of the smaller waterways have quite tight bends, as you can see on this one on the Canal de Bourgogne, and you need a horn to warn anything coming around the corner that you're riding shortly. And indeed, there is a specific 7E sign, which you will occasionally find on the bank that actually instructs you to sound your horn as you approach. A spotlight is a very useful piece of safety equipment, particularly if you're going through some of the tunnels in France, and a number of the canals have quite long tunnels. You need a knife, or possibly two, and preferably serrated. This is not for pelling borders. This is essential in the unlikely but occasional event that you get hung up in a lock. This is where your mooring lines, when you're going down in the lock, get tangled in some way, and you have a few seconds to decide whether to cut the line or risk severe damage to your boat as the water recedes. And finally, you need mooring lines, and as a minimum, I would suggest two mooring lines the length of the boat, and two that are twice the length of the boat. And the latter come in useful on occasions like this. This is a lock on the Canal Lateral à la Loire in France. This is a 10-meter deep lock, and it's quite exceptionally deep. There are no bollards other than at the top of the lock. And if you don't have lines, then you're forced to the expedient of tying two lines together, possibly with a sheet bend. The problem with that, of course, is by the time you get down to the bottom, the sheet bend is halfway up the wall of the lock. And if your crew decides to remove it the normal way, which is by pulling on the fixed end, there's every chance that your sheet bend will get tangled up at the top. What will tend to happen then is the French lockkeeper will wander over, give you a pitying look while he untangles your sheet bend at the top, and mutter under his breath something like a merde, les Anglais encore. Do not ask me why I know this. Other equipment, you do require a holding tank on the inland waterways. And indeed, it is increasingly becoming mandatory in some areas. There are plentiful holding tanks in the Netherlands, and indeed it is quite easy to pump out your holding tank in that country. However, as you go further south, you find that they are increasingly a rarity. In France, I'm afraid to say, the few that you find around are very often broken, or they are locked, and the only boats that hold keys to them are the hotel boats, who obviously have a lot to pump out on occasion. There is generally a phone number for you to ring. You can ring the local town hall, but typically you will find, if you can get through, that the key is held by Alphonse, who is actually playing pétanque with his friends that day, but may be able to get down after lunch the following day. So in France, I'm afraid the reality is that most people pump out discreetly away from areas of population, and away from moorings. It's the reason why you should never eat any fish that you may catch in the inland waterways. Mooring stakes and a hammer are particularly useful in France. As I explained earlier, where the banks are suitable, you can bang in a couple of mooring pins with a hammer and tie up to them, and spend as long as you like completely free out in the countryside, in complete peace and quiet. You will need a water hose and electricity cable. Generally speaking, the recommendation is two 25-meter lengths. The shorter length for when the water point and electricity point are actually on the mooring, but there will be quite a few occasions where you need the the extra length, because otherwise you will not be able to fill up with water, and you'll be without electricity, and your batteries will be getting increasingly flatter. Binoculars are very useful, particularly when approaching locks. It does help if you can see what the status of the lock is from the warning lights at the lock, and start to prepare your boat accordingly. And cycles are invaluable. Firstly, for extending your range for tourism. There's many attractive sites that you can see a short distance from the waterways, but also for cycling to nearby restaurants, and particularly for supermarkets, groceries, wine stores. In France, they're particularly useful because as I said earlier, there are tow paths in very good condition alongside most of the waterways. What about navigation? Most people use a software package called Waterkarten, which was originally produced in the Netherlands, but now extends to 6 countries, including the UK. Unlike traditional chart software, this contains detailed information on all the locks and bridges, and it also has an auto-routing function. It costs about €50 a year for an annual subscription, though you can take it out for shorter periods. There is one other piece of navigation software called Navi, which is produced by the VNF in France, and that is a free app for Android and iOS, and that is very similar to Waterkarten, though it doesn't have quite the same functionality. Paper charts are really very much a dying breed, and are, to be honest, best avoided. If you can find them, and most of the chart publishers have gone out of business, you will find that they are quite out of date and not to be relied on. Whereas the chart base of apps like Waterkarten or Navi is, in both cases, virtually continuously updated. Guides, I've mentioned the guides that we produce. There are other guides, including guides in German and French, and indeed Dutch. The problem with traditionally printed guides and pilot books is that they're produced in an edition which then sells out, and it may take up to 6 or 8 years for that edition to sell out. So they do tend to be rather out of date. And indeed, we have actually bought some in the past when we first started, and discovered that some of the information was over 20 years out of date. Communications, VHF is very advisable on the inland waterways, and as I said, compulsory in Belgium. However, you are required to have a set that has a ATIS, that's Automated Traffic Information System. It's similar to DSC, but this is unique to the inland waterways, and you mustn't use DSC on the inland waterways. What it does is simply broadcast a short package of information identifying your boat at the end of each transmission. Most modern sets will have ATIS or can be switched to it. Many older sets can be returned to the manufacturer or their agent to be fitted with ATIS. What some people do is equip themselves with an inexpensive handheld VHF in order to comply with the rules, particularly if their installed set is older and can't be adapted. I should warn you, however, that to use VHF as your main or only ship station is against the rules in Germany. So if you do adopt that approach in Germany, it's best to use it from down below rather than in full visibility up on deck. Mobile telephony, when we started on the inland waterways, was really rather patchy, but today it's really very good. And for the past 7, 8 years, we haven't experienced any sort of black spots at all. There are more black spots to our experience in the UK than there are on the inland waterways. For internet, unfortunately, most UK SIM cards, if you use those, do have a data limit when you're roaming, and you will be lucky to get a roaming data allowance of much above 20 gigabytes per month with a UK SIM. As a result, what most of our members do is tend to use local SIMs, and you can get some, particularly in the Netherlands, which give you unlimited data for around about €30 a month. And then finally, under communications, of course, you'll be familiar by the time you get to the inland waterways with all the 70 signals. And there are a number of recognized visual and sound signals which are used between boats to indicate their intentions. So what is it actually like navigating the inland waterways once you're there? Let's look first at the big rivers. In France, you've got big rivers such as the Saône, the Rhone, and the Seine. In Belgium, we have the Scheldt, and in France and Belgium, you have the Meuse, which then flows into the Netherlands. And because they like to name things differently, it becomes the Maas in the Netherlands. In Germany, and France, you have the Rhine, which then flows into the Netherlands, where it becomes the Waal. What characterizes the big rivers? They're not always as serene as you see in the photo. This particular one is actually the Marne. There can be occasions, especially in early spring, where there's snow melt coming off the mountains, or at other times when there's been continuous periods of heavy rain where there can be strong currents. And you need to be able to cope with these, which is why you need, especially if we're going upstream, a very powerful engine. There's also a concomitant risk of flood at those times. In our early days on the inland waterways, we very stupidly, because we were short of time, decided to take a risk on the River Seine. We soon learnt, to our astonishment, that when we arrived at the first lock, we had 2 red lights, which indicates that a lock is out of action. Luckily, the lock keeper was doing his garden just by the lock, and he simply waved us over the weir. We went in succession over 3 weirs where we had 2.5 to 3 meters over the weir. It was a rather foolish thing to do. It was a lack of experience. And in reality, we were probably uninsured. If we'd had a prang, we probably wouldn't have been able to claim. And so it is not worth taking the risk. And the big rivers should be respected. And it's very wise to check the weather conditions before you travel on them. You will also encounter heavy commercial traffic on many of the big rivers. On the Maas and the Rhine, for example, there are barges of 2.5 to 3,000 tons. And the general rule is you just stay out of their way. They are much bigger than you are. Speed limits are higher on the rivers. 20 to 35 kilometers an hour is not unusual. And on many stretches of the big rivers, there is no speed limit at all. That can be quite useful if you happen to have a fast planing craft that you take over to inland waterways, because it does give you the opportunity of opening up the engine and clearing the injectors. The locks, as you'd expect, because of the size of the commercial traffic that uses them, are pretty large. And the bridges have a high air draft of generally 6 meters or above. And that is again to accommodate the commercial traffic. I mentioned our incident on the Saone back in our early days. We subsequently went past this house and discovered that it was actually 100 meters from the riverbank. They were marooned like this for almost a week until the floods came down. But being French, one assumes they had a pretty full wine cellar. So now looking at the canals, by contrast, there are no appreciable currents on the canals. The only currents you do need to allow for is if a lock is emptying and you're moored waiting for it, there can be an appreciable downstream current until the lock is emptied, but nothing like what you get on the rivers. Similarly, the flood risks are quite limited. What is more of a risk on the canals is drought, particularly in France, where with global warming, the summers are getting longer and drier. And it is not unusual for the depths in some of the waterways to be reduced, or in extreme conditions, even close some stretches altogether. The commercial traffic is lighter, and certainly in this kind of waterway, this is the Canal de Bourgogne. You will see nothing bigger than the Dutch barge I showed you earlier, many of which have been converted to hotel barges. Speed limits on the canals are generally lower. 6 to 10 kilometers an hour in France is quite typical. 10 to 12 in the Netherlands. So really, it's very much life in the slow lane. You're going along most of the time at a fast jogging pace. The locks are smaller, such as the one you see here in the photo, and the air draft of the bridges you'll be going under is typically around 3.5 meters in the French canals, rising to around 5 kilometers. Sorry, 5 meters on the bigger Dutch canals. The next most common question we're asked is about the locks. This is an example of a river lock. This is actually on the River Maas. They're characterized by a large range, typically 10 to 15 meters. There are even some in the Netherlands, and in Germany, I should say, which are above 25 meters to allow for large commercials. Commercial traffic invariably has priority, and that is controlled by lights at the lock when you arrive. What will happen? There is a red lock and a red light and a green light. A red light indicates that the lock is being used by other traffic, probably coming the other way. When you get red and green, that indicates that the lock is being prepared for you. And obviously green is when the lock gates open and you can actually enter. One needs to be a little bit careful of taking advice. We were waiting for the lock with a Dutch boat, and the skipper said, "Well, go, go, go. We in the Netherlands we go on red and green," and this is true of the bridges because the Netherlands has thousands of lifting bridges, and every time they lift, obviously the traffic is interrupted. So the bridge keepers welcome it if yachts go through as quickly as possible. So they do dash off on red and green. You should not do this with locks on the inland waterways. And if you do, you may find that you have something like this big barge coming up behind you. And the first you know is a thundering blast from the horn. And the next thing is you get a severe wigging on the VHF and the lock keeper. So do not listen to Dutch skippers who say, go for the lock on red and green. Again, do not ask me how I know this. The bollards in locks are, in this lock, they are rising bollards mounted in these slots you see in the wall. And you simply tie onto these and you go up and down with the bollard. Um, if they don't have rising bollards, they usually have fixed bollards in the slot about every 2 meters. And you become quite adept at leapfrogging your lines as you go up and as you go down. The river locks are generally mostly gentle. There's very little turbulence in most of them. So you can usually get away if you have a midships cleat with using 2 lines on the midships cleat and just going up and down that way rather than mooring fore and aft. Generally, they have long periods of operation, and certainly on the big rivers, such as this one, they'll be operating 24 hours a day. So, what is the difference with the canal locks? Well, firstly, they have a smaller range, 3 to 6 meters, 6 meters being the exception. Most of them are between 3 and 4 meters rise and fall. Generally, there's less commercial traffic, and if there is commercial traffic, on maybe some of the larger canals in the Netherlands, for example, it is nothing like the size of the big rivers. Increasingly, the locks are automated, by which I really mean mechanized. In the Netherlands, there is usually a lock keeper at every lock who sits in his box and just presses buttons to operate the lock. In France, there are really 2 main systems. On the waterways where there's been investment, you're issued with a remote control as you enter the waterway. As you approach a lock about 50 meters away, there's a sign on the riverbank. You press the remote control button and you trigger the lock cycle that way. If there's a red light, you'll get a red and green light, which indicates that your instruction has been accepted. On the older canals that haven't been fully automated yet, you will find there is a gantry on the riverbank which extends over the canal. There is a pole hanging down. You motor slowly up to that pole, give it a sharp anti-clockwise twist, and that will then trigger the lock cycle. The lights will tell you that again the instruction has been accepted. On some occasions, you may come across 2 red lights. That can indicate that a lock is completely out of action. But more usually, and certainly in France, it simply indicates that you have arrived either before the lock is in operation or afterwards. And on some of the smaller, less frequented canals, it simply means that the lock keeper has gone for lunch, and therefore you can't go through until he comes back. Unlike in the UK, where many of the locks are self-operated, that is very rare in the inland waterways. We've only in 10 years encountered one waterway, which was a small waterway in France off the River Seine, where you actually operate the lock yourself. Unlike the river locks, you are tying up to bollards or mooring posts mounted on the bank at the edge of the lock, and this is where your boat hooks come in useful to hand your lines out and drop them over the mooring bollard. Unless you're exceptionally good at lassoing, it's the safest way of actually doing it. Some of the locks can be turbulent, and it is strongly advised to moor fore and aft at every canal lock. It's not wise to just tie up with the center line cleat, because as you go up in the lock, it can be turbulent with the water rushing in. If that is the case, it's usually less turbulent if you're going down, but it's always wise to moor fore and aft. The canal locks normally have limited operation. Typical operating hours are 9 o'clock till 6 in the evening, sometimes a little bit longer in the season. And in the smaller waterways in France and the Netherlands and Belgium, quite often they will take a short lunch hour in the Netherlands and a relatively longer one in France. To show you how easy it is to pick it up, this was a couple we encountered on the Canal de Bourgogne the first year we went cruising. The lady on at the bow has a spaghetti rope in her right hand. What you can't actually see is that neither end of the rope is connected to the boat. So they made a total hash of the first mooring they did. This was obviously their first day out on the waterway. However, we went through a further 10 locks with them. And by the end of the day, they were doing it like seasoned professionals. So it's something that is quite easy to pick up. Next question we are often asked is there are tunnels on the waterways, how do you handle those? The majority of them are on the French canals, and because the French canals are older and many of them go through very hilly or mountainous areas, there are quite a few tunnels on them. They vary in length from 200 meters to just under 6,000 meters, which is the longest. Generally, they have little commercial traffic. The only time you'll ever meet a commercial on the waterways or tunnels is if they've been diverted from another waterway, which can sometimes happen. They're again controlled by lights, the same system. Red light means stop and wait. Red and green means get ready. Green means go. It's obviously very important to obey the lights. If you do go through when you don't have a continuous green light, you may get halfway down the tunnel and find you have to reverse all the way out again because there's something that has right of way that's coming the other way. The tunnels are mostly lit, but a spotlight is really essential. Firstly, because the lighting can occasionally be out of order. Secondly, because there's a few of the tunnels that aren't lit at all. And thirdly, there can be sections where they haven't replaced the bulbs. So you suddenly get to the middle of the tunnel and things go very dark for you. In Operating times are more or less the same as the lock operations, except for the really long one, the 6,000 meters, which is the Riekeval tunnel. And with that tunnel, you go through from one side, the south side in the morning, and from the north side in the afternoon. This is an example of a tunnel on the Canal de Rhône, and from this you can see why it's pretty essential to have a spotlight. If you didn't have a spotlight for this tunnel, it's very unlikely you'd come out the other end without a few marks on your top sides. What are the mooring arrangements like on the inland waterways? Generally speaking, you can find free bankside moorings in most countries. They're most prevalent in France, and I've showed you how it's possible, as in this photo, to knock in mooring posts virtually anywhere and tie up to them. In the Netherlands, in Friesland, there are over 600 moorings provided by the Marquette Foundation, and you will also find the occasional a bankside mooring that has no charge in other parts of the Netherlands. The second kind of mooring you'll be using is so-called halte nautique in France and Belgium. These are small mooring places provided by villages and small towns to attract tourism to the town. They normally consist of short lengths of quay or a short length of pontoon or staging, taking maybe six to eight boats. Very often they will even have water and electricity. Some of them they will charge, but the smaller ones are completely free. And the reason for that is firstly, in order to attract tourism, and secondly, if there are only sort of 3 or 4 boats there at any one time, it simply isn't worth them employing somebody to collect the relatively modest mooring dues. Larger towns and cities have generally municipal quays or basins, which were formerly used for commercial purposes and now are given over to leisure traffic. And you'll find these in all inland waterways countries. They typically are supplied with water and electricity. Very often they'll be manned. There'll be a small sort of marina office. Quite often they will have showers, toilets, sometimes a small laundrette and Wi-Fi. The next category is motor yacht clubs, and these are particularly to be found in Germany and the Netherlands. Um, these are small marinas, and in some cases quite large ones, which have been given over to motor yacht clubs to manage. The larger ones, there will be staff on site, and there'll be a full range of facilities, even including pump out stations and fuel pontoons in some of the larger ones. In the smaller ones, there may be somebody who comes down in the evening to take any harbour dues, and in both cases, it's usually quite clear where you moor because there's a visitor's pontoon or visitor's quay where you're meant to park. And then finally, fully fledged marinas, full service marinas with all the facilities. They're not particularly common in France. I would guess there's probably no more than around 20 on the in the Time Inland Waterways network in France. They a bit more common in Belgium, and as you get further north in Germany and the Netherlands, they're quite frequent. I would guess they're probably well over 100 or maybe more in the Netherlands. Next question we're often asked is about obtaining supplies. Fuel stations, I have to say, are quite rare in France and Belgium. If you can make out the photo behind, that's one on the River Marne in France. It was one of only two that we found on the rivers in 10 years in France, and we found never found any on the canals at all. Um, Things get better as you move further north. They're relatively good in Germany for fuel, and in the Netherlands, even some um, yacht club marinas will have a fuel pontoon, so it's not difficult. What is the general practice in France and to some extent in Belgium? Many boats carry a couple of 20-litre jerry cans and a trolley, and every time you come across a garage that's within easy reach of the waterway, you just trundle up there with your jerry cans, fill them up there, and top up the tank that way. It's a bit agricultural, but the alternative is you risk running out of fuel if you rely on waterside fuel points. Water and electricity are pretty easy to obtain in marinas and municipal moorings. And as I've said, even at many out in nautique, they'll be provided. A unique feature of France is that many of the locks also have water points. And if nobody's waiting for the lock, it's perfectly acceptable to fill it with water before you trigger the lock and leave. Groceries are generally good in Belgium and the Netherlands and in Germany. However, on the smaller waterways, it can be difficult to actually get foodstuffs. I remember spending 3.5 weeks on the Canal de Bourgogne in France, and we only encountered one supermarket in all that time. Ironically enough, there was a hairdresser in virtually every village, so the French have an odd sense of priorities. Obtaining repairs and spares is very excellent in the Netherlands and very good in Germany. Again, I have to say, getting repair work done and obtaining spares can be difficult in France. To give you an example, we had our bow thruster fail last year. We were in or approaching the Dutch port of Harlingen. I rang the nearest yard on a Friday when we arrived. They told us to bring the boat round at 8:30 on Monday morning. They lifted us out, diagnosed we needed a new motor. They sourced the new motor. They sent one of their staff on an 80-kilometre round trip to pick it up. It was fitted and we were relaunched in the afternoon by about 4:30. By contrast, another member had the same experience in France and were initially told that it would take 6 weeks to, firstly, to source a replacement, and then secondly, because the engineer had lots of work on and was then going on holiday. Luckily for them, they managed to circumvent that and get it repaired more quickly. But it does perhaps illustrate the difference between the Netherlands as a country to get work done and further south in France. In France, it does pay to be largely self-reliant. Gas is fairly easy to get if you use gas at most supermarkets, but one point to note is that in all countries they have proprietary national brands, so you can't exchange cylinders between countries. That can require some careful forethought if you're going to be cruising through a number of countries on a continuous basis. So finally, what does it cost to actually cruise the inland waterways? The photo shows a typical village out nautique in France. Again, there's only room for one boat or possibly two rafted together. But this is the kind of free mooring opportunity I mentioned in France, where you can stay for 2, 3 days. Probably after 3 days, it's time to go, and you might be chased off by a local. But if nobody else is using it, you can stay longer. So in France and the Netherlands, it's possible to moor for free. And indeed, some people spend several weeks selectively cruising from mooring to mooring without paying anything. Municipal moorings will generally cost you the order of 12 to 18 euros. This is based upon a 12-meter boat. Motor yacht clubs, maybe 18 to 24 euros for one night, and marinas around 24 to 36. Normally, this will include water and electricity, although increasingly in the Netherlands, you find that there's a separate charge, a metered charge for water and electricity. If you compare that with a coastal marina in these countries, where you're paying for 12-meter yacht typically around 60 to 80 euros, you can see how much more cost effective it is to cruise on the inland waterways. And finally, what does it cost to lift your boat out and lay it up? In the water, typically you'll be paying 600 to 800 euros for 6 months for 12-meter boat. It's possible to find places where you can do it cheaper, though there may not be places that your insurance company would approve of. So 600 to 800 is a safer limit. Lifting out will typically cost between 1,300 and maybe 2,000 euros. Interesting enough, the 1,300 euros is a rate you'll find in the Netherlands, where there's more opportunities. The 2,000 is the rate you will find in France, where frankly there are very few opportunities to lift out, and you may have to travel some distance to find them. So most people in France tend to winter in the water. The next level up is storage in a covered shed. That will cost between 2,000 and 2,500. Again, this is not impossible to find in France, but rare. The further north you go, the more frequent it becomes. And the ultimate in luxury is a frost-free shed, which will cost you between 2,500 and 3,500. You tend to find these more in northern climes in the Netherlands and Germany, where they can have quite hard winters. If I tell you that to keep our boat in a South Coast marina, our local marina here in Lymington, today would cost me around £15,000 a year, whereas we keep our boat in a heated shed for 2,500 euros. And when we come back for July and August, it costs us about another 500 euros to store it in a marina that will satisfy our insurance company. That's 3,000 euros, which is roughly £2,500. So you can see how, although the two are not directly equivalent, you can cruise for anything between 4 and 6 years in the European Inland Waterways for what it would cost you to keep a boat in the UK. So my my throat has just about lasted out. I'm afraid I have a very bad sore throat at the moment. I'll leave you with this picture, which is the um, a mooring at the lovely French village of Millery, which is just off the Moselle. And I think it sums up the attractions to most people of the inland waterways. It's serene, it's a beautiful environment. You have a lovely village within close walking distance, and they provide a mooring where you can stay completely free and enjoy the experience. So I hope that's answered many of your likely questions about the inland waterways and motivated you to come and at least give them a try. So all I can say is do come on in. The water's lovely. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Gordon. I mean, I'm so glad we actually recorded that because there's so much information within that that there's no way I think anybody could keep it all in. But thank you so much for giving us your time this evening and all that amazing information. However, there are always going to be questions. There's always going to be something there that somebody's going to have asked at some point. So I'm going to bring Jules and Andy back in now because obviously there's quite a variety of questions, and so going to start with our first question, for which I think is kind of for you, Jules. Which route would you recommend for a first-time inland cruiser?
Well, thank you for the question. Can I just answer one or two things that Gordon raised in his talk? I'll be very, very, very brief. He was a bit dismissal of paper charts, but he's not on a yacht which has possibly has a chart plotter. We have a paper chart or the guide in front of us all the time and find them completely invaluable. I'd support his suggestion that you become skilled at sheet bends, because we too have become very good at emergency sheet bends in very deep locks. I've managed to tie on a lot of ropes. One other thing about inspecting boats for documents is that we have been breathalyzed, and it's not uncommon in Belgium and the Netherlands to be breathalyzed. Can we share the screen with a picture of us? Or anyway, so that was what I wanted to say. Where would I recommend someone going into France, into Europe for the first time?
Yeah.
You could go into the Netherlands because you can go in mast up, going at Vlissingen and go straight in there, mast up, and some lovely places to go to. But if you just had a fortnight to spare and you were a South Coast sailor, you could go up to Dover, across the Channel, thousands of people do it these days, into Calais, an excellent place because you've got when you go into Europe, you have got to go through the Police aux Frontières and log in somewhere. And at Calais, you can go in the Police aux Frontières, a very short bus ride away. The CA has an app which will tell you exactly how to do it. You go into Calais and get a little bus into the Police aux Frontières. And in Calais, you've got excellent restaurants. There's a chandlery, fuel, and supermarkets and so on. And from then on, 30 miles takes you into France, perhaps to Air-sur-Lys. And from there, you can go up via Lille to Ghent and to Bruges. There's no lock between Ghent and Bruges. You can do that in a day. And then you can do that little circuit and come back down to Calais again in a fortnight. It's a lovely little trip. We met a couple who had a saddler, 26 foot. They'd come into come into Calais, had their mast removed in Calais, stored, and then they went round that northern part of France before collecting a mast, and well, they had their mast on board and sailing back. So my suggestion is, if you're a real novice and want to experience the inland waterways of France, go to Calais. If you're a sailing boat, have the mast taken off. If you're a motorboat, just go on in. And it's an absolute joy. All those lovely cities to explore, and it's very, very easy. One or two challenging locks, but there are everywhere. Yeah.
Thank you, George. That's very helpful. Another question has come in. I'll direct this one at you, Andy. How do I find updated information on waterways closures or navigational issues? And how does the information provided vary between countries?
Well, that's really a two-part answer. The first part, I think Gordon's probably covered fairly well, that the CA runs not only the books, but it also runs live site where people will log very transitory information, such as the bridge has just broken down at XYZ, and then maybe a couple of hours later, it may be logged back again and saying, no, up and working again. So the CA does a lot of stuff. Boats are cruising all over the place all of the time. So that's very good sort of live information from other cruising boats. After that, then all the countries have a national service of one sort or another. Most of them are certainly understandable in English, shall we say. Some of them are very good in English, some of them not quite so good. Again, the book started that Gordon did about first overall book of cruising in the waterways. We'll give you the information for all of these. The water carton got mentioned several times. This actually started in the Netherlands, and the coverage in the Netherlands is absolutely excellent. It's now at a level that you can actually link it to your AIS, and it will actually, as you come up to a bridge or a lock, if you're on a main barge route, it will actually ensure that the lock or bridge is open for you automatically. So it's a kind of moving target. They've spread into Belgium, they've spread up into Denmark and across into Germany. But in each of those areas, the coverage gets not as good as it is in the Netherlands. I would add a small comment to this, and that's if you want to start just gentle cruising and get the hang of all of this, then quite frankly, the Netherlands are your best bet. It's extremely well organized. 1 in 6 of the Dutch population of families are supposed to own a boat. There's 3,500 kilometers waterway with at least 4 meters of headroom and at least 1.3 meters of depth. So you can wander for a long time, and it's really the most gentle way to start any of this. Going down through France is certainly a lot more interesting, perhaps with scenery and other things, but you will find many more lock closures and other things, and you will have to keep an eye ahead on your route and make sure you're able to travel. So, two-part answer: join the Cruising Association and get full information all the time from all the boats that are actively cruising, and that will include wider lists of things than just bridge closures and so on, and look at the national services in each country to see what they give you.
Yeah, I would agree with Andy completely on what he said about the Netherlands being the perfect place because it all works. The locks are nice. It's just designed for boats, and France is challenging. But I would put in a plea for Belgium, which is halfway in between the two. And it has nice locks, good food and so on. And it's a bit slightly more challenging, but interesting.
And of course, all of these countries have great beer as well, so we're quite lucky about that. On but just following on from that, we've covered off the sort of great places to go for the first time. But are there any that you know of? Are there any sort of like opportunities where people can go cruising in company, where people can sort of take a tester with other people, or is that just not something that really happens?
There's hire boats available widely. The Dutch ones are, generally speaking, built as a hire boat to be used for 3 or 5 years and then sold to the private market. Because of that, they're quite significantly better quality, shall we say, than the average hire boat, and certainly much better than ones you'd see in the UK. The comment, the Dutch boats, they do actually look for you to have some kind of confidence, or you have to do a morning or afternoon with them when they supervise you. If you move to other waterways, then it's not quite so regulated, shall we say. If you look at it in other ways, we have a service in CA which is Meet Your Friends. We call it Meet and Greet. And we can actually, if we choose to, show the location of our boats at any time. And we usually ad hoc agree to meet in places saying, oh, I've just noticed in a couple of days' time, I think we're going to be in pretty much the same spot. So we agreed to meet, and then usually take a photo of the people who met up and post it onto the CA site. So that's easier when you look at the size of the countries where the boats are moored, their home moorings. Everybody's a bit too spread out to make it very easy to do standard sort of let's all meet in Calais and cruising company.
Excellent. Gordon, one for you. Are the waterways the full depth up to the banks, or do they shallow? He's thinking of mooring up with a yacht with the 1.7 meter draft. So is it kind of like a square bottom, or is it just?
Well, mostly, I would guess he's probably talking about going down through France, and I would say that most of them are so U-shaped. It comes back to the point I made about twin screw vessels. The stated depth in the canal is at the centre, and in many canals, especially these smaller ones, they haven't been dredged for quite a few years, and there's less depth at the bank. So, in fact, some yachts actually take a plank with them, so that, and I've actually seen several yachts in France that do this, where they're close to the draft limit. They run themselves into the bank and essentially dig their keel in because the mud is quite soft, and then they use a plank, a gang plank, if you like, to get ashore. And with that sort of draft, 1.7 meters, certainly if you're going in the summer, I think you'd have to be prepared for, grounding when you moor up on one or two occasions. I remember one time we were in, I think it was in Decize in the Loire Valley, and we all of a sudden there was a yacht that tried to moor alongside us and raft up, and he couldn't actually make it. And he was 1.8 meters draft. He'd come up from the Mediterranean, and he'd managed to get that far. But in that one day, he'd gone aground 13 times. So this was sort of late June, early July, at which time the water levels were probably slightly less than normal. So I think with that sort of draft, I'd recommend sticking to the main routes where the draft was a bit more guaranteed. And certainly the rivers, there's more draft there, but to be cautious when mooring up to the banks, and just accept the fact that it may on occasion be a question of digging in and using a plank to get ashore. But certainly you can get down to the Med with that sort of draft if that's what the person is considering.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, I would suggest to you there's another hazard, and that's you want to look out for trees. There are quite a few moorings you could get into in the Netherlands, but they are noted in our various books. But it does also warn you that there are trees overhanging them.
That's a great shout. That's a good point, because you don't always consider that. You consider you're hitting the bottom, but not the top.
I think Gordon makes a very good point about the route you choose, because near Decize, along those waterways, it does get shallow, doesn't it? And we came across a boat, 1.8 meters draft at least, and she had to be Migen, and she had to be tipped on her side to be dragged up the river to get her out again. So if any of your listeners are thinking, can I try this at 1.8 meters? Go for the routes Gordon identifies as deep. Don't go up that Loire Canal lateral à la Loire area. It gets very shallow in the summer.
I should add one thing. I actually mention in the presentation. You do have a choice if you're taking a sailing yacht down to the Med of actually taking your master with you, which some people do, or of having it transported. Increasingly, certainly we find our members tend to prefer taking the mast out and having it transported. Because obviously if it's with you, then you feel it's more secure, but it isn't necessarily. And certainly if you're going through locks with a mast extending maybe 2 or 3 meters either end of your boat, there's a very good chance that it will get damaged on the way down. So what you've saved in mast transportation, you will lose in repairs. So that is something I forgot to mention, but is to be considered, I think.
We had ours sent down by road, but I would warn listeners or viewers that all masts look the same when they end up down at Port Napoleon. So make quite sure you've got it labelled properly.
That's a great bit of advice. Yes, because as you say, when they're all lying in a rack somewhere, it's kind of, well, pick one.
Port Napoleon might have 20 masts in a rack.
Yeah. Um, an interesting question. This one. Someone's written in. You make it all sound so attractive. Is there a service whereby CA members can swap, borrow, charter the boats of other members, given the post-Brexit restrictions on use? So I suppose if you've got a boat over here on the inland waterways and you wanted to sort of do a little bit of a boat swap and go and try out the canals, I suppose that's what that question is about. Is there something? Is that something the CA do?
Well, there is a crewing service which people can subscribe to. I don't know how many skippers are on that who actually are on the inland waterways. That I'm not aware, but certainly for sea sailing, there's regular opportunities for people to crew for skippers who are in need of extra hands on board their boats. But I don't know if that crewing service has inland waterways people. It may do. I don't know the answer to that.
I'm not sure my
Something to find out. Yeah.
not sure my insurance company would like it. It's somebody called what's it? Something like Haven Knox-Johnston. I think.
Yeah, yeah, that lot. That
I think
fantastic. Great
the
insurance
answer
company, I should say.
the answer to your question, Paul, is I don't think we do have a similar sort of arrangement, really. But if somebody put a thing up on the crewing section and said, I'm looking to join a boat somewhere on the inland waterways, they might get a place. But there isn't an organized mechanism. The best thing is actually to charter a boat. If you're again, if the people watching are thinking, do I want to do the inland waterways, charter a boat somewhere. And the most popular area is around Auxerre and around that area, and have a week or two on the boats.
Fantastic. Great advice. Next question coming in. Gentleman's got a 6.25 meter Jeannot Merry Fisher. Is it too small to attempt to cruise on the European Inland Waterways?
No.
Not at all. No. In fact, you could probably choose most of the routes that would be denied to bigger boats with deeper draft. When we went down to the Mediterranean, we couldn't even consider the inland waterways. We were a draft of 1.83 and overall length of 13.22 meters. We were just too big. But that size of boat could even use the southern route along the Canal du Midi, assuming the draft is not too deep.
You see some incredibly small boats going through the lock, some that you would think were completely unsuitable, almost like life rafts. So there's no small size. You just have to be brave the smaller you are.
Well, the only point I would make about power, if you're going to big rivers, the Rhine, for instance, at a reasonable rate in the summer, is going to be flowing at 3 to 5 kilometers, and quite regularly will be up above that. So if you're going to go on big rivers, be a bit careful about water conditions and the amount of power you might need.
Having said that, I think I showed the photo of the floods on the Saône. We actually managed to moor up at a place called Tournus, which is a little bit further south on the Saône, and I was astonished to see a sailing yacht, which was probably no more than about 8 meters, that had come all the way up the Saône from Lyon, and he was continuing on. And I think he even went out on the Saône when it was in flood. And I did actually meet him later further north, so he did actually make it. So it depends entirely upon how bold you are. Again, I would say though that you need to consider the insurance aspect. I suspect that he was either not insured, or if he was, he was just taking the risk. I doubt if Haven Knox-Johnston would have covered him for that trip.
Did he have his wife with him? No, I mean, that's the other usual question.
Sorry, what was that?
I said, did he have his wife with him? That is the navigation.
No, it's two blokes. If had he had his wife with him, this wouldn't have been on the waterway. I think I can say that with certainty.
Another question: is the 20-meter limit in Germany just on the Rhine?
I don't believe so. I'm not an expert on Germany. I think it's certainly you need the Rhine patent if you go on the Rhine, but I think to take a 20-meter boat in most places, I believe you do need extra qualifications. I don't know if Andy, you know the answer to that one.
Everywhere. The only reason I know this is because I know about Aquanaut's boat sizing and what they have to do for the different markets. Because if they go above certain sizes, then it becomes progressively more difficult to sell a boat because it's more limited market. So I think yes, it is an absolute limit.
Mhm.
And someone's asked, what is AIS? Good question. Which,
It-
what's that, Andy?
Shall I do it? Okay.
Yep.
Yes, sorry.
Is
You mentioned it.
is the latest, most sophisticated way of basically any boat exchanging information which tells the world at large what its name is, how to contact it, what speed it's doing, what course it's on, etc., and gives position information, etc. So if you've got a suitable receiving end and you've got a chart plotter, you can see on it in real time if there's a barge coming up behind you. Usually a good plan to wait and follow them through the locks. You can see it at some junction points. You can see where the traffic's coming from, etc. It's again, it's a variable because in the Netherlands you will pretty well see most boats now carrying it because there's a lot of advantages to what it enables you to do. If you're on a fairly deserted area in France, you're not going to see much interest or advantage to it. But in time, it's going to spread because there's places like Antwerp where you're not allowed actually now to enter the port or through the port without having an AIS broadcasting information on your position, etc.
It
Yeah,
actually stands. It actually stands for Automatic Identification System. I've just Googled to check, so if in doubt, that's what it stands for.
but you can either receive or transmit and receive. And if you're receiving, you can see all sorts of other ships. If you're transmitting, they can see you as well. And if you've got the French Navia or the water carton, you can actually see other boats on AIS. So as you're going, the Navi French one, you can be going along, plotting your position as you go, and you can see other ships transmitting on AIS. But they don't all do it, so it's not infallible.
And if you want,
Mm.
you can buy a transmitter receiver unit. You unplug the cable from your VHF aerial and put it in one side and put the junction cable in on the other side back to your VHF, and the unit is just standalone in the middle and will automatically be broadcasting and then has a feed, and it could be either NMEA 0183, the standard one, or it could be any other of the coded signals that you can plug to other equipment.
Excellent. Excellent. Right, I'm not sure if the next two questions can kind of be linked, whether they're going to be totally different answers. So, Gordon, I think for you this one, what are the best times of year for cruising inland waterways? And I don't know if the answer to it's going to be the same, so I'm going to ask it at the same time. Someone else has asked, what is the best time for maximum water for the Med Transit? They could be linked. I don't know.
Well, for the Med Transit, that's easy. I would say probably early spring. That's when you have the guaranteed greatest levels, because of course you get the snow melt off the mountains, and usually the reservoirs are full, should be from the winter, and some of the canals are dependent on reservoirs, obviously for the water coming down from the summit level. In terms of the best time to sorry, the first question is about the best time of year to
The
cruise
best time of
generally.
year for cruising the inland waterways, yeah.
Well, certainly for my preference, we cruise mid-May to end of June, early July. We come back for July and the first half of August, and then we then cruise from mid-August to the end of September. The weather's not as guaranteed, but it can equally be quite hot. And of course, that is also the busiest time. Everybody in France goes on holiday on the 14 juillet, 14th of July, so it's very busy from then on. And in the Netherlands, equally, those are the busy holiday months. So because we are limited as Brits to 90 days, I mean, it may be that the questioner can stay for longer if they have an EU passport or a special dispensation. But certainly for people who are limited to 90 days, I would say probably late spring, early summer, and then late summer, early autumn. That's when we do it anyway.
Brilliant. No, they're absolutely, and you guys probably know better. Another question comes in. They've got a Linson 47 and want to enter the German canal system in Lübeck. They have a normal air draft of 5 meters and a draft of 1.4 meters. What is your opinion about the northern German canals? Have heard they're difficult.
That's a tricky one for all of us to answer because, relatively speaking, the German canals are not travelled widely by pleasure boats. Mostly they head to Berlin and cruise to the area around the lakes. So we do have members who cruise more widely, but not none of the three of us would know Lübeck in particular, or I'm afraid to be able to answer that.
We do actually have members who've cruised that area, and I think the simple answer is why not join CA, put a query on the forum. We have a dedicated forum for the Inland Waterways. You'll get probably 3 or 4 answers within 24 hours. So that's the brutal answer, if you like.
Well, I mean,
certainly,
it's one of those things. Well, and we've got you guys here, and there is so much knowledge within the Cruising Association. It's unbelievable. And so by joining it, you have access to all that sort of information and data that you can sort of get from fellow boaters like yourselves. Next question is coming in about the ICC. Where can you do the boating part of that without taking a full RYA day skipper course? Are there places that just do ICC tests?
well, the answer is yes. In fact, we sailed for, as I say, for 40 years on the under sail, and we never had the ICC. But we were going to Montenegro on the way up the Adriatic, and Montenegro is the one country around the Mediterranean and Northern Europe that insists on having the ICC. As you enter, it's one of the documents you're required to produce. So we actually took a test in Oblico Bay in the Ionian, and we went out with an RIA instructor who was probably in his early 20s. He looked about 14. And I was required to demonstrate various maneuvers and tacking and jibing and anchoring and whatever. We got out of the bay. He wanted to get into the open water. We were hit by about sort of 32, 35 knots of wind. So I calmly put it on the autopilot and went forward to reef down. And when I got back, his knuckles were white, ripping onto the gunnel. So he said, right, we can go home, you passed. So the reality is, if you're experienced, they will just validate your experience at a RIA centre, and they will issue you the ICC. At least in those days they did. I don't know if they've tightened up at all, but the RIA would give you the answer to that.
Yeah.
And actually, if you're an inland waterway enthusiast in the UK, there are test places and courses. There used to be one just near Marlow at the centre there, where you're qualified, but you won't qualify for a coastal version. You're qualified for an inland waters boat version. But if you want to avoid having to do the full thing at sea and do the navigation, etc., that's probably a decent option. And they incorporate the 70 in it as well, by the
way. We've got 2 more questions. Gordon, the first one for you. What are the best countries for affordable long-term mooring? I think you mentioned this in one of your slides, didn't you? But are they? I know you kept yours in a frost-free shed. But was that one of the cheapest countries, or are there other countries that are?
No, I think for long-term mooring, I don't know whether the the question is asking about liveaboard or whatever, but certainly France, I would say, is easily the obvious place. And if you consider that residential barge that I showed in the photo, one of our members has a liveaboard barge. I would guess that probably 3/4 of the liveaboard barges in the European Inland Waterways are probably in France. It is easy to find residential moorings in France, and you can stay for extended periods by driving in mooring posts and then tying to those. All you need is permission from the local VNF office, and from my experience, they can be quite affable, and as long as you're nice to them, you can stay for several months.
Yeah, I
But
would
if you want a
agree.
permanent,
I would agree
Yeah.
about France because we are in Aire-sur-le-Lys, which is 30 miles inland from Calais. It's a brand new marina. We've left the boat in the water for 6 months, and it's €500, which seems pretty reasonable. And it's a lovely marina, but there are no services. There's no engineers, there's no lift out or anything. But if you're prepared to just want to leave your boat, I don't know what the annual fee is, but it's not very much, probably £1,500 euros or something. So France probably is the cheapest option of them all.
Like everything else, if you go into other countries like Netherlands, you need to pick where do you want to moor, because there are plenty of places which are, shall we say, in the south, off the beaten track a bit, etc., that would reduce those prices quite a bit. And in fact, I do know of at least one CA member who's in an undercover mooring just south of, well, just as you go into Zealand, and is paying only €1,500 for it.
For an undercover mooring, is for that for 6 months for the winter?
Broom 41. It's a reasonable sized boat and full. He said, I was very surprised. It's just south of Williamstad, actually, on a minor route down there.
No.
I did say 2 more questions, but one's just come in. Do you need to change your anodes for the inland waterways?
Well, it depends what anodes you've got for the
Yes.
Well, traditionally, most of the boats are generally, if they're going to be used all the time there, put on aluminium ones.
Perfect. And but last question, if there was one thing you know now that you wish you'd know when you started the inland waterway or the European inland waterways, what would be that one thing? Start with you, Gordon.
Oh, that is a difficult one. I think the simple answer is that I was grateful to be a CA member, to be honest, because it was a completely new area to me. I was a sea sailor for sort of 40 years, and I knew virtually nothing about the inland waterways. And in fact, the only reason we started was because of Brexit. We had this brilliant idea of having a motorboat on the inland waterways, and our sailing yacht, which was then in Croatia. So that would give us 3 months and 3 months. And of course, that was completely knocked out the water because what happened? Well, Croatia became part of Schengen, so that was that was ended. That's not really answering the question, but
No,
was,
absolutely. No, if you'd known, what information you could have got from the CA back then it would have been it was a great start. And Julian,
But the one thing we wish we'd known, but we did actually know, Vanessa sitting next door to me, is that you need a long boat hook, a very, very long boat hook. But the other thing I think we wish we'd known, or we'd learned, unfortunately not to disadvantage, is that the inland waterways are like motorways. And if there's a blockage, that's it. If you're at sea, you can go to another port. But if you're going down a route, there can be a blockage, it can be floods, it can be droughts or anything. So you need to plan ahead. I think it's the one thing we really need to know before doing anything on the inland waterways. What's open, what's closed.
Mine is much more simple, and it's don't believe the horror stories you'll be told.
Yeah.
brilliant.
The Solent up the Seine to Paris, which we thought would be a bright idea. We were treated to endless stories of how the barges would flatten us, and many other such stories, none of which were true. What you've heard today is there's a lot of boats out there, a lot of boats traveling together, a lot of people very happily doing it, wide range of places you can go and things you can do. So anyone who starts spinning horror stories at you, it'd be as well to try and find out just exactly what they did do, because it really is unlikely that there's genuine horror stories.
Well, all I can say is a huge thank you to the three of you for this evening, for your time this evening. It's been hugely educational, and your special knowledge in all these things has been gratefully received by, I'm sure, by everyone who's been listening, and certainly from myself. And you know, just to everyone listening, you know, the Cruising Association is a great sort of group of like-minded individuals who who are more than happy to share knowledge, and it's such a big source of information for anyone wanting to take on trips like this or anything like that. And I think as I think Gordon sort of intimated there, one of the first things to do if you're planning on a trip or you don't know that sort of thing, there's going to be a member of the CA or who has probably been there and done it. So they're hugely useful, they're hugely informative, and a well-structured and a well-informed group of people. So I think all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you to Gordon, Julian, and Andy for all their time this evening. And for everyone out there, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening.